known as Bleeding Kansas, and a lot of lives were lost and a lot of hatred was stirred up. Again, I could go into more detail. A man named Beecher sent a bunch of rifles from Massachusetts to Kansas, and these rifles were to be used by anti-slavery people, and they called these rifles Beecher's Bibles, and they were used to arm the anti-slavery people in Kansas, all of which again, stirred up a lot of hatred that, as we know, was to lead to war. Well, a new political party came on the scene called the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings were copied the secret societies like the Masons. The reason they're called Know-Nothings was, if you ask them, what do you do at your secret meetings? I know nothing. What do you people believe? I know nothing. The answer they were to give was, I know nothing. You know, they wouldn't tell what they went on in their secret meetings. But what is known about them is that there were two things. They were anti-foreigner, particularly they were anti-Catholic. Officially, they called themselves the American Party. They put up a candidate for president in 1856, pardon. In 1856, they put up a candidate named Millard Fillmore, who had already been president. Millard Fillmore got 8 electoral votes. He carried the state of Maryland, but he got no farther than that. Now, again, folk, I believe I have to mention this because I think I've told this class, anti-Catholic sentiment ran strong throughout much of American history, just like racism did. I mean, it's just two ugly facts involved in American history that you can't sweep under the rug, and I won't try to. But again, they Know-Nothings were very strongly anti-Catholic. One reason they reared their head at this time is a whole lot of people were coming over here who were Catholic from Ireland and from Germany. Germany was part Catholic and part Lutheran, but most of the ones, the Germans who came over here were Catholic. And these Know-Nothings, quite frankly, did not want them in. And they wanted laws to be passed that would restrict them. These laws, by the way, were not passed. Again, the Know-Nothings were Protestants, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, otherwise later to be called WASP, W-A-S-P, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You might keep that term in mind. We'll run into it later, the WASPs. All right. Then there came another new party. The Republican Party. The Republican Party put itself together pretty fast after the Whig Party failed in 1852. Most of your Whigs joined the Republicans. The Republican Party was the first major anti-slave party. If you don't count the Free Soilers, they never got a vote, but the Republican Party was the first party to get an electoral vote that was strongly or completely anti-slavery. Now, as we discussed in a little bit in the morning class, when the Republican Party was first formed, and right after the Civil War, almost all your black people were Republican. And when I was about 16 years old, I listened to Jackie Robinson on the radio. This was in 1964, so I'd actually been 15, during Barry Goldwater running for president. And Jackie Robinson was all for the Republican Goldwater. And she said, I've always been Republican, I'm Republican all the way, and I will always vote Republican. That was in 1964. But shortly after that, a lot of black people left the Republican Party in droves and joined the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party was first formed as an anti-slave party, and this sounds modern, the Republican Party also got a reputation for being the party of the well-to-do and the rich. And this is a stigma that has been attached to it from that day till this. The party of the rich, as opposed to Democrats, which is the party of supposedly the party of the common man. Again, I'm not trying to promote politics, it's just these are the way things seem, and each of you can make up your own mind for yourself what you believe. The Republicans argued that anyone who is willing to work can make his way in a free society That's one reason they promoted freedom instead of slavery. They believed an individual should pull himself up by his bootstraps. All right, the election of 1856. This was the first election where a Republican ran for president. The Republican's name was John Fremont. And there was a popular slogan, Fremont. Yeah, I've got an accent above the E there in Fremont. Fremont had made a name for himself by discovering paths in the West. He got the nickname of the Pathfinder. His trails led to a lot of people moving west. He had a few problems, though, in that he could not manage business affairs, and he might have made a very terrible president. He was a terrible administrator. In the meantime, though, his wife, who was his most loyal supporter, got together a bunch of women and got Republicans. Well, even though the women did not have the right to vote, the women were highly influential, and she organized a whole lot of women's clubs who promoted Fremont. And a popular slogan was free soil, free men, free speech, Fremont. That had a popular appeal. But the Southerners said if Fremont is elected, Fremont's government would be a hostile government to Southerners, which probably would have been the case. But Fremont did not make it. Instead, the Democratic Party passed over Pierce and passed over Douglas. Both men had problems, and they appointed a dark horse. For that matter, Pierce had been a dark horse also. James Buchanan had been ambassador to Great Britain, so he was out of the country during all the turmoil in Kansas. So he did not get his hands dirty from the turmoil in Kansas. James Buchanan won the election, but by a bare margin. And the Republicans said it's a victory for us because it's our first time running and we almost won. So they felt quite happy about their performance. And they said, we didn't win this time, but we will the next time, which they did. Buchanan goes down in history as the only president we ever had who never married. The story goes, as a young man, he had a girlfriend one time, but her father did not like him and broke them up. And he tried to reconcile, but she died on him in the meantime, and he kept her letters by him, and he insisted that when he died, those letters would be destroyed, so we don't have a copy of those letters today, the letters that she and he wrote to each other. But he kept them till the day he died. But he never married. There is another story about him, that during his administration, Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, sent two of her daughters to Washington on a visit. But when the word got here that they were going to see, it was up at Great Britain's attempt to make up, because after all, Great Britain and us had been enemies, and they said, well, they're English speaking like we are, and they're democratic like we are. Let's make up. So Queen Victoria sent two of her daughters, but the people of Washington were just scrambling around. Where is there in all of Washington a place nice enough to house two members of the royal family? And in those days, they didn't have any fancy hotels. They said the only place that's nice enough is the president's own bedroom. So President James Buchanan volunteered to sleep out in a shed outside the White House. But that was kept super, super secret, and very few people know about it to this day. But James Buchanan slept in a shed while that the royal daughters, unknown to anybody, slept in the president's own personal bedroom, which was the only room in Washington that would be nice enough for royalty. All right. Now, that's just a little bit of personal stuff that I'll throw in from time to time. Buchanan won the election, as I've already mentioned. Now, in his inaugural address, James Buchanan appealed for unity, like Franklin Pierce had. Franklin Pierce spent a lot of his time appealing for unity. Buchanan did also, and he said, I hope that the upcoming Supreme Court decision will forever, once and for all, decide the issue of slavery. Didn't. Well, Kansas continued to be an armed camp. Fighting broke out. Now, the fighting was not just confined to Kansas. In Washington, Charles Sumner was a northern senator, and he was sitting at his desk one day when a southern senator barged in and beat him with a cane and kept beating him. It was 3 years before the seriously injured Sumner could return to his Senate seat. He eventually was restored to health, but in those days, so they didn't have the medicine or the surgeries you have today. It took Sumner a long time to recover. But this created a whole lot of fury on both sides. The Southerners called Preston Brooks. That was the man who beat Sumner. I'm not going to write his name down. But Preston Brooks was looked on as a hero by the Southerners. Sumner had made a speech against the South recently, and that's why Preston Brooks struck him several times with a cane. Keep Sumner in mind, though, because we're going to run into his name again when we start talking about Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. So, in other words, there was some fighting going on, not just in Kansas, but in Washington also. All right, now here comes one of the worst things that could have happened at the time. Dred Scott. The Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an African, a slave. His master started out in Missouri, where slavery was legal, but then his master temporarily moved up to Wisconsin, which was at that time a territory, not a state, where slavery was not legal. Then his master moved him to Illinois, which was a state. Illinois was a free state. Well, Dred Scott did not finance, because going to the Supreme Court is expensive, but a bunch of northern businessmen, lawyers, got together, and they took Dred Scott's case to the Supreme Court. They argued that because Dred Scott had lived in a territory and in a state where that slavery was illegal, Dred Scott should have been freed at the time his master moved to these places. This was a decision that James Buchanan was referring to in his inaugural address. James Buchanan stated that he hoped that the decision the Supreme Court made would solve the agitation over slavery, and that's exactly what the Supreme Court hoped to do. All right, here's the decision, folks. Make a long story short. The Supreme Court ruled that residents in a free territory did not make a slave free. Therefore, Dred Scott was not a free man. They could have stopped right there. That way it would only have affected Dred Scott, but they kept on going. They said that Congress had no right to designate the territories to be part slave and part free. Therefore, all the compromises that have been worked out, including the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was also an attempt at compromise, all these compromises were declared null and void. Here's what the logic they were using. Folks, this is still a law that's on the books. There's a clause in the Constitution that a legal document issued by one state is binding in another state. What this means is if I have a Georgia driver's license, and I do, that license has to be recognized if I drive in the state of Tennessee, or if I go to Alabama and drive in Alabama, and a cop wants me to show my license, I'll pull out my Georgia driver's license. They have to recognize that. I have a marriage license. That marriage license was issued by the state of Georgia, but if I moved to Florida, Florida would recognize me and my wife as being married. That's the law. It's been the law from the beginning. Now, yeah, but still, there's some catch-22. For instance, you get a gun carrying permit, a concealed weapons permit in Georgia, you'd better look and see which states it's recognized as valid in, because it is not recognized as valid in every state. Now, I know it's recognized as valid in Kentucky and Ohio, but it's not recognized as valid in some of the states. And again, you got to be careful carrying your gun in which state you carry it in. All right, but here's the logic. That a person who's a slave in one state must be recognized as a slave in all the states. What this meant was simply that slavery was the law of the land and it was equally applicable everywhere. There really was no such thing as a free state. You know, if a Pennsylvania factory owner wanted cheap labor, All right, he couldn't buy slaves in Pennsylvania. No one there would sell them, but he could easily go down to Maryland, go to a slave auction, pick up a bunch of slaves, and carry them to his factory in Pennsylvania, and nothing the people of Pennsylvania could do about it. This decision was supposed to solve all the nation's problems concerning slavery. It didn't. The Southern people hailed the decision as being, hey, this is wonderful. The Northern people said this is terrible. Chief Justice Taney, and I want to quote him. Now, I don't want to quote him because he used a word that I'm not going to use, but he said, the African has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Unquote. Paraphrase quote, if you understand. With this, he hoped that the agitation over slavery would be ended. Instead, it got worse. This decision has been called the worst decision the Supreme Court ever made. I'm not going to ask, because they don't tell, but I had a Russian student one time in one of my classes. And this Russian student said, in any government there has to be a person who makes the final decision on all matters. I said, no, not in a democracy. Final decisions are made by people who sit down and negotiate and hammer out their differences and try to come to an agreement. The Supreme Court was making a final decision, which is not democratic at all. Within 4 years, the Northern and the Southerners were shooting at each other. The decision was rendered in 1857. The war started in 1861, almost 4 years to the month later. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous person at the time, later said, the Supreme Court need us. They shot themselves in the foot with that decision. Worst decision they made, again, in my way of thinking, they've made some bad ones. And keep in mind, folks, they usurped the power that they used to overthrow compromise that has been hammered out. And they rendered any further compromise on the issue impossible. Without a chance to compromise, what could the two sides do but shoot at each other? Now, as for Dred Scott, well, his owner died. When his owner died, his son freed him. So he became free. But very shortly after becoming free, Dred Scott himself died, so he did not live to enjoy his freedom for very long. The Republicans exploded in outrage. Taney hated Republicans. He hated racial equality. And Taney was a Southerner. All right. This takes us up to the election, the midterm election of 1858. Now, you know this country has elections every 2 years, 4 years for president. In 1858, it was time for Stephen Douglas to run for Senate. Douglas was running in Illinois, so Douglas left Washington and went to Illinois to campaign for Senate. Opposing him was Abraham Lincoln. I won't write his name down. I mean, all of you know Lincoln is probably, hopefully all of you know Lincoln is very important. Lincoln and Douglas were friends, had been friends for all along. And I think I mentioned last time in this class how that Lincoln and Douglas had both courted the same girl as young men. And she wanted to be First Lady. And of all things, she married Abraham Lincoln. And you wonder, what kind of insight did she have? And she got to be First Lady. Any person in their right mind who had a choice between Lincoln and Douglas would likely pick Douglas. Douglas was educated. Douglas was a politician already, and Douglas was a winner up to a point, it seemed, even though Douglas goes down in history as a loser today, and Lincoln goes down as a winner. But at that time, Lincoln seemed to be a loser. Douglas was a winner, or it seemed to be. Anyway, now, in those days, senators were chosen by a vote of the state legislature. They were not chosen by popular vote. Now, the 16th Amendment changed all that. In the early 1900s, they decided to make the country more democratic, and senators are now chosen by popular vote. So Lincoln and Douglas were both hoping to get votes in the Illinois Senate to put themselves in office. Well, all right. Sometimes in any kind of race, the persons who are behind have an advantage over the front runners. Now, like in a foot race, the front runner has one serious disadvantage in it. He doesn't know where his other opponents are. Why? Well, they're behind him for one. Now, they know where he is because he's in front of them. They know where, but he cannot turn around. I had a student, why can't the front runner turn around? Anybody know? He'll slow himself down. And every champion runner knows this. A good runner will not turn around until he crosses the finish line. Well, anyway, Lincoln had the advantage, one advantage over Douglas, in that Douglas was hampered by his former speeches, his former stances, and having to abide by the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln, well, hey, I don't have any former positions to hold, and I can say what I please, so he had an advantage over Douglas in that regard. At first, Douglas would draw, in those days, politics would campaign, they'd gather a crowd around, and they stand on a stump and make a speech, and then move on to the next town, get a crowd together around. They'd send someone ahead to announce they were coming when they'd be there, get a crowd, stand on a stump, and make a speech. Well, Lincoln managed to be right out of the sight of Douglas. As soon as Douglas would leave, before the crowd dispersed, he would come in and he'd make his speech. This went on for a while, and it looked like Lincoln was outdoing Douglas, and finally Douglas decided, well, listen, Mr. Lincoln, why don't you and I get together and debate? Now, this was one of the first debates in history. Today, debates are a big part of the political process, and every president in recent, or in your lifetime, has engaged in debates to get the nomination, to get the election. Presidential debates made the news in 1960 because the presidential debates was what was believed to have helped John Kennedy win over Richard Nixon. But we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, they got together. Lincoln talked so eloquently that the people of the country started reading what he said in the newspapers. Lincoln made remarks, and he quoted Jesus here. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it cannot remain divided. The house will not endure permanently half slave or half free. A lot of the northern people agreed with that. But finally, Mr. Lincoln, all right, I'll digress a little bit. A few years ago, right here in Atlanta, they got two men together, one of them tall and lean, and one of them short. And the tall and lean one was pretended he was Lincoln, and the other short one pretended he was Douglas. And these two men had memorized portions of the debate, and they would debate over the issue in front of each other. But finally, Lincoln asked Douglas the question that Douglas did not know how to answer. The question was, can slavery be excluded from a territory before that territory has formed a constitution? If Douglas answered, yes, it could, he was violating his own doctrine of popular sovereignty. If he said no, it couldn't, he was violating the Supreme Court. So he hauled around and said, well, slavery cannot exist even for a day or an hour anywhere where it is not wanted. This became Douglas's Freeport doctrine, and it really hurt him. The Democratic Party rejected him, and it guaranteed that Douglas would never get the Southern vote. Lincoln lost the election. Lincoln went from the election feeling somewhat downcast and feeling I've been defeated again. It turned out it was his last electoral defeat, but he didn't know that. Have been defeated again. Douglas went on thinking, I'm going to become the next president of the United States. He didn't. Douglas went away, but Lincoln had gained in political stature. Douglas had permanently hurt any of his chances of ever becoming president of the United States. Famous Lincoln-Douglas debates remembered because of the fact that Lincoln was to become president later. 7 debates were held. They were well attended. They received a lot of press. They would have been on TV if they'd had a television back then, but they did get sent throughout the country by means of telegraph, which was in widespread use at that time. Lincoln was thrust into the national spotlight. All right. Threats of secession began to mount. John Brown was hung, but he met his death bravely. Many Southerners believed that all Northerners were like Brown. Hey, the Southern people would gather around at dinner time after the evening meals, and they'd talk, say things like this, you know, if those Northerners had their way, all of our slaves would be free. You know, say, yeah, and what would they do as free person? They're free to go where and do what? Oh, those slaves could never manage themselves, and these Northerners don't realize that. I mean, that was their attitude. And talk about how terrible the Yankees were. I'm not talking about the ball team either, but that was a term that they used for all Northerners. Well, 1860. The election of 1860 has been called the most important election in all of history. I'm going to sum it up real briefly, though. The Democrats passed over Buchanan. They passed over Buchanan, and they nominated Douglas. But a bunch of Southern Democrats walked out and said, "We're going to nominate our own candidate." This was a fatal blunder. So the Southern Democrats nominated their own candidate. Well, if that wasn't enough, there was a move to reconcile. Hey, let's come up with another third candidate who can reconcile the two factions and get votes from all and unite the Democratic Party. So they put up a third candidate. What this meant was the other two wouldn't quit. That meant the Democrats had three candidates in the field. The Republicans put up one, named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln barely got it, folks. I once read an account. At one point, when they were about to ballot, the printing press broke down, and they had to delay the balloting overnight. And during that night, Lincoln's supporters stayed up all night campaigning for him, for Lincoln. If that had not happened, perhaps Lincoln would never have gotten a nomination. As it was, Lincoln barely got the nomination of his party. Then Lincoln sat at home. He did not campaign. He waited for the results of the election. He had no plan. He did make one promise, though. He said, if elected, I will not allow slavery to extend any farther than already. But he said, yeah, I will let slavery go on where it already exists, but I don't want slavery expanding outside its borders where it does not exist now. So he pledged himself that far. The Southern people didn't vote for, in fact, his name was not even on the ballot in most Southern states. Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote, but he won the election because the Democrats, 60%, voted for three different candidates. So Lincoln, for him, it was an electoral landslide. If it hadn't been for the Southern states, he might have carried every state in the Union. But the Southern states did not vote for him. Meanwhile, South Carolina said, if Lincoln is elected, we will leave the Union. Now, in 1860, they had the telegraph, but not every precinct had one. Telegraph was, but every capital was connected to each other by means of telegraph. But a lot of precincts, so it took a while for the votes to be counted. The election occurred in early November, as they all do. But it was December before Lincoln knew that he won the election. It was at that time when South Carolina legislature received a telegram that Abraham Lincoln was the next president-elect, or was the next president of the United States. South Carolina balked a little bit. I mean, it was one thing for you to promise something, it's another thing to carry it out. They balked, but they left the Union. They telegraphed the other states, say, are you going to leave too? One by one they did. 7 states left the Union during what they call secession winter. That is the winter of 1860 and 1861. During December, January, February, and March, 7 states left the Union. Then Lincoln began to head for Washington and for the White House. There was a plot afoot to assassinate him, which was found out, so they sneaked him into the White House. Your book, they sneaked him in after dark and sneaked him in on a freight car, which would not attract suspicion, and got him to the White House safely. And he became president. Now, one thing I want to mention, if you look at the pictures of Lincoln, Lincoln was the most photographed president up to that time. The pictures of him showing him running for president show him without a beard. The pictures of him when he first was elected show him without a beard. But a 12-year-old girl wrote, "Mr. President, I think you should grow a beard." So he started growing a beard after he was elected, and on his way to Washington, he stopped at the New York town where he knew this girl lived, and he asked the audience, "Does little Miss So-and-so live, is she in the audience?" Several people in the crowd pointed out, "Yeah, here she is." Lincoln asked if she bought before, and he said, "As you can see, I've taken your advice, and I'm growing a beard." The girl was terribly embarrassed. But anyway, Lincoln was our first president who had a beard, and except for all of our presidents from him until the 1900 had beards. President William McKinley refused to grow one. But Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, and Cleveland twice, all had beards. Roosevelt, who came after McKinley, grew a mustache. But anyway, just thought I'd throw that in. Again, some people thought Lincoln looked better with a beard than he did without one. Now, as the states were leaving the Union, a lot of senators got together and tried to work out a compromise. Henry Clay was deceased. Like my history teacher in 8th grade said, but Henry Clay did not live forever. No, but I don't believe Henry Clay could have worked a compromise at this point. But Henry Clay's successor in Kentucky, Mr. Crittenden, tried to work up a compromise. Thanks to the Dred Scott decision, thanks to the United States Supreme Court, compromise was now at this point totally impossible. The people, the two sides, were not allowed to get together and hammer out their differences and work out an agreement. No compromise could be reached. All right, with that ends chapter